Hello everyone. I have been promising a video on what the Constitution really means, and I think this is the same discussion on what may seem to be a broader topic, which is what is worth fighting for from a societal standpoint. But those are really two forms of the same question in my mind. There are so many factions right now among the common views about what it means to be an American, and though some of them pay lip service to the Constitution, most are just concerned about making sure their desires are met or their needs are met. Now, this is not really a left-right thing, as we'll explore, though there's a much higher probability that leftist groups would not revere or respect the Constitution or the idea of the Constitution. Many of these groups are openly against the Constitution or even the basic ideas of liberty and capitalism. Groups on the so-called right, of course, are more likely to profess a support for and a reverence for the Constitution. But none of this really matters at all in today's version of the United States, because even those on the right who claim to be proponents of the Constitution don't understand the basics of it, and they're willing to bend just as much as any Democrat when they can gain advantage by ignoring it. 100 years of these attitudes have made a country that doesn't operate like a constitutional republic at all. It operates very similarly to a pure democracy. But what do I mean by this? I mean that increasingly any restriction on the freedom of citizens can be made into law just by majority vote, even though that law may clearly violate the constitutional rights of the citizens who are restricted by it. The Constitution isn't functioning to protect liberty anymore. To illustrate how this isn't a left-right issue, consider the case of a self-titled conservative radio host named Mark Davis. I had heard him state on his show a number of times in analyzing state law that a state could make a law against eating bananas, and that would be perfectly constitutional because it doesn't say specifically in the Constitution that such a law cannot be made. I called into his show and challenged that assertion, and the result was some very groundbreaking radio, which you can find the link for below. So even among political thinkers on the right, the state has pure power over the individual in a democratic sense, and that there is practically no requirement on the part of legislators to meet a constitutional standard in controlling the behavior of citizens. If that's the case, is that a society that is worth fighting for? If I get no value from the Constitution in protecting my liberty from any legislative body who thinks it has a nifty idea and can either force me to behave a certain way or to work for free to give them the value through taxation, then why have a country? It doesn't matter to me whether some Solutrean man runs me through with a Clovis point or some fat bureaucrat in a swanky office takes all my money. The goal here is not to be told what to do. The goal is freedom, and we'll focus on this in a minute. But why kill all of those thousands of well-dressed British soldiers if in the end we're just going to let someone else reduce us under absolute despotism? That seems to be going to a lot of trouble for nothing. And the answer to that question is, of course, there is no reason. This isn't the country that was fought for. So let's get that out in the open right now. All the USA today is a Western democracy. All that it is a Western democracy. And that's a very lame thing to be. I, for example, would rather roll the dice and live under a dictatorship, because at least there's some probability of having enlightened and benevolent leadership in a dictatorship. With a democracy, you're governed by average minds by definition. That's not a society that's worth fighting for. So the task of this video is to describe what the Constitution really means, and therefore what is worth fighting for. And once we have that baseline of understanding, any individual can say either that they are for that set of ideas or against it. So there'll need be no confusion when the fighting starts about who values which ideology and what we are fighting for or against. We'll begin by looking at Mark Davis's argument. When Mr. Davis said that the state could make a law against eating bananas simply because the Constitution did not say such a law was prohibited specifically, he overlooked the Ninth Amendment. We always hear about the First and Second Amendments, but rarely is the Ninth brought up. In many ways, it's the most important amendment of all. When grouped with the First Amendment and the preamble, which defines the purpose of the Constitution, I think a bulletproof case can be made for an interpretation of the Constitution that can be understood by virtually every citizen. The Ninth Amendment says merely this: The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. It's a very concise and unambiguous statement. In other words, the fact that a Bill of Rights exists can't be used to suggest that those are all the rights that we have. We have other rights, which cannot be denied or disparaged any more than those that are explicitly stated. Further, and quite importantly, there is no addendum or appendix or other section in the Constitution that lists the full range of what rights are included under other rights. In other words, our right to freedom is literally unlimited. But where is my support for that? First of all, I don't need any, because that's what the Constitution says. It's written in English. Just read it. But in order to understand where that amendment comes from, we can just look at the Federalist 84 by Alexander Hamilton. In that essay, Hamilton argues against having a Bill of Rights at all, because he believes that specifying some rights will allow people to claim those to be the limit of our rights. And in his words, the people surrender nothing. And as we retain everything, we have no need of particular reservations. Now, Hamilton didn't get his way in that we have a Bill of Rights, but he did get Amendment 9, and that must address his concern. Mark Davis's argument proves that Hamilton's concern was well-founded, and that he foresaw the argument that Mark Davis would make. And we have the Ninth Amendment, which destroys his argument. The Ninth Amendment guarantees us freedom and the blessings of liberty as established in the preamble as the purpose of the Constitution. Now, leftists always want to lean on the clause in the preamble about the general welfare. And based upon that clause about promoting the general welfare, they can do literally anything to us. But that doesn't stand anywhere near to reason, because there's the word "and" in there, in the clause, joining it to the phrase "securing the blessings of liberty," which means that both promoting the general welfare and securing the blessings of liberty must be true simultaneously. That's the mathematics of it. That means that promoting the general welfare can only mean to promote the philosophy of freedom, which does not allow wealth redistribution. What you're left for with the role of government, when this is all boiled down, is defense and some forms of infrastructure. That's it. Everything else in the constitutionally allowed society consists of free markets regulated only by uniform contract law. Basically, that means you can do whatever you want, as long as you're not violating someone else's rights. And the bulk of the court system in that society is designed to hash out disagreements along those points, rather than deciding whether an arbitrary or tyrannical law is being broken by a citizen. And why is the First Amendment, on the other hand, so important? Well, obviously, it's about free speech. That's what we always hear about. And that's extremely important because of what the First Amendment also means, which is even more important. I'm talking about the part about no law being made that respects an establishment of religion. This part of the First Amendment is almost universally misinterpreted, especially by the right. The left don't really interpret anything, but the right will often misinterpret the First Amendment. And this plays directly into the hands of the left. But when you do the math, what this piece of the First Amendment means is that a law must be based in reason rather than dogma. That's the very first sentence of our Bill of Rights. It means something important. Now, of course, free speech is necessary to call attention into the general awareness when a law is made that is dogmatic or does not meet the standard of reason. It's this dual functionality of law being limited to the realm of reason and no limits on free speech that makes the nation a constitutional republic rather than a democracy. But why is it so important to limit law to reason? Because reason and common sense don't always arrive at the same conclusion. And for this country, reason is going to be the standard, not something that can be influenced by religion, such as the opinions or desires of the majority. But most people don't know what reason is anymore, because when someone says something like a certain concept is reasonable, that's become a very weakened concept. In general practice, that's a standard of common sense, not reason. But reason is a much stricter standard. Now, this idea of limiting law to reason is much more damaging to the left than it is to the right, of course, but most on the right don't understand this. And thus they continue to shoot themselves and the rest of us in the foot on this topic whenever they have the opportunity. All one has to do to illustrate this relationship is to look at Elena Kagan's Supreme Court confirmation hearing. Tom Coburn asked her a very important question as follows. If I wanted to sponsor a bill and it said, Americans, you have to eat 3 vegetables and 3 fruits every day, and I got it through Congress and that's now the law of the land, you got to do it. Does that violate the Commerce Clause? Kagan replied, sounds like a dumb law, but I think that the question of whether it's a dumb law is different from the question of whether it is constitutional. And I think that courts would be wrong to strike down laws that they think are senseless just because they are senseless. Now, it seems to me that I'm the only person on the planet who immediately was aware of the significance of that statement. I almost did a backflip when I saw that. It's the most fundamental question in all of political philosophy, and it just went right over everyone's heads. And I think this illustrates how far down the rabbit hole this country has been dragged. But just think about what that means. The question of whether a law is dumb is different than whether it is constitutional, and the courts would be wrong to strike down laws they think are senseless just because they are senseless. But what is senselessness? Well, there are 2 realms of thought. One realm contains everything that is senseful. That means the practice of thought is based on evidence from the physical world gathered through our senses. This is the world of science and reason. Then there's the senseless realm. On the one hand, this could just be the babblings of one absolute nut job, but that's not the flavor of senseless that we mean when we're talking about law, because one nut job's ideas are not going to influence law. It's the other flavor of senseless that we're talking about with respect to the Constitution. That flavor of senselessness means that we're talking about beliefs held by large numbers of people that are not of the senses. This is what we call religion or dogma or faith. The First Amendment guarantees us that a law will not be made that respects an establishment of religion, which means laws that are not of the senses even in part, let alone those which are senseless. This is a direct negation of Elena Kagan's treasonous assertion. There is no more fundamental point in human communication, because reason demarks the difference between a person who can participate in a society and a dangerous animal. A 1,000-pound hungry lion cannot govern itself according to any reason-based agreement held with its prey. Every human being who can belong to a free society, on the other hand, must yield to reason by decree in our Constitution. Now, if a Supreme Court justice thinks that a law that is senseless can be constitutional, where does that leave us? This condition produces a definable, knowable, mathematical result. It produces something called pure democracy. This is what we experience every day. Laws that are senseless have been deemed constitutional. But a pure democracy cannot protect the rights of the individuals in the society because it cannot yield to reason any more than a wild animal can. Kagan should have been rejected and ejected on the basis of this response immediately. No, Ms. Kagan, pardon me. A law that is senseless is, according to a proper interpretation of the First Amendment, by that fact alone unconstitutional. Every law must accomplish 2 things at least. It must first be for the purpose of securing the blessings of liberty, which, as we'll detail later, is mainly to secure free markets. But it must also stand to reason against all challengers. If it can't do those 2 things, then it's unconstitutional. Now, the final thing to understand for the purposes of this video with respect to this grouping of the Ninth Amendment, the Preamble, and the First Amendment is the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. I'm talking about the part where it says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. All levels of government, state, local, county, have their own local areas of concern, but they have no more power than the federal government to violate the unlimited rights of their citizens without justifying those laws under the constitutional test we've just covered. Can a state make a law against eating bananas merely because the Constitution doesn't specifically say that they can't do that? The answer to that question, according to the Ninth Amendment, is no. It's not no, but hell no. The Ninth Amendment doesn't allow anyone to make that law unless he can show not only why it is necessary to securing the blessings of liberty, but also why it is reasonable to believe that the actions defined in the law will have the stated result of securing liberty in free markets. An arbitrary law against eating bananas has a steep uphill climb to meet that constitutional standard. It can't do it. Note this society could not have passed Obamacare, or even public funding of education for that matter. These two are clearly violations of the First and Ninth Amendments and clearly exist in conflict with the spirit and letter of the preamble of the Constitution. Now, some may argue on the public education point, well, education was around in Jefferson's day and he was all for it. Well, to which I merely retort, he was also a slave owner. And it was his Declaration of Independence that ultimately led to the end of slavery. The Constitution is a strangely great product of Western thought. It is better than the men who created it. And it continues, in spite of all attacks against it, to demand that men of reason and wisdom recognize its fundamentals and make efforts to apply them because of their intrinsic value. It doesn't matter who wrote it. It is what it is. The genius is in the words, not in the human beings, the biological computers that created it. It's the value of the logic and the reason. It was the product partially of slaveholders that ended Southern plantation slavery, this Constitution, and many other kinds of slavery. And it will also be the Constitution that results in the end of modern slavery in the form of Obamacare and the public funding of education. Under the Constitution, freedom is our right. And that means that free markets are our right. And free markets don't exist where there's a force-funded government alternative or government option. A free market, capitalist society with strong national defense and secure borders is the birthright of American citizens. A society where those aiming to control our behavior through legislation must meet a rigorous standard of reason every step of the way, with a strong bias against enacting any unnecessary law, is the birthright of American citizens. That is the society that the Constitution describes, and that is the only society worth fighting for. If you think it's acceptable to force other human beings to do anything other than stop violating the rights of others, you're not welcome in a free society. You should be regarded as an evil outcast, as a dangerous predator that cannot be reasoned with. If you find comfort in the ideas of Stalin or Mao or Karl Marx, you should find no comfort within the boundaries of the United States of America. You are the enemy to our Constitution and our chosen way of life. So just what side are you on now when you see it in that way? So let all of this sink in and know that you can't get this analysis anywhere else. Believe me, if anyone else were making these points in this way, I wouldn't bother doing it. I'd rather not do it. I would be pointing you towards their channels. But if you recognize original thought, please consider subscribing, liking, and contributing to my channel through Patreon or PayPal as below. To say that I'm up against headwinds in this fight is an understatement. But I'm seeking leaders for whom these words resonate. Our country, the United States of America, as described in our Constitution, is worth fighting for. It is that freedom that has created the greatest nation the earth has ever seen by far. And it is that Constitution which can continue to accomplish these seemingly miraculous things. When people are free, blessings happen. You can call it faith if you prefer, but that's not what it is. It's reason. Thanks for watching.